In the coarse environment of boilers, ovens, and fire, among men accustomed to heavy work, who spent long periods talking about everything from everyday life to politics, the character of the person whose life we are going to narrate today was forged. In his multifaceted roles as journalist, agitator, organizer, and later as a statesman, one can glimpse that metal forged in the steel that his father instilled in him, from whom he learned the virtues and defects that would accompany him in his life, and that, after many experiences, will lead him to push the entire Italian nation into an unparalleled historical period in the 20th century, followed by a war conflict with worldwide repercussions. The political doctrine under which Mussolini would come to power in that nation of Mediterranean Europe has been understudied beyond simplifications. Fascism was a novel idea in that context, a movement nucleated by war veterans, generically nationalists, and framed in revolutionary syndicalism, remembered with contempt by many and with nostalgia by some. Today we are going to tell you the story of Il Duce Benito Mussolini like no other channel has done. Let's delve into his life, his tenure in power, what his real political ideas were, and what his tragic end was like. This is Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the new encyclopedia. Benito Milcare. Andrea Mussolini was born on the 29th of July, 1883, in the Italian town of Predoppio. Son of a socialist blacksmith from the town who instilled in him from a young age a passion for the manual labor that defined the Italian man, the uomo. His mother, in contrast, was a schoolteacher and a devout Catholic. The Mussolini family lived in poverty in the overcrowded rooms of a tiny palazzo. His father, adamant in instilling in Benito the ideal of the strong man, spent his time in taverns, spending the money that came home on other women. Benito grows up to be restless, aggressive, haughty, and disobedient. The teachers at the local school cannot calm his impulses, and his mother decides to send him to the Salesian College of Faenza, where, after preventing his food from being stolen, he is expelled and then sent to Josue Caducci School in Forlimpoli. Although he was constantly switched from one school to another, his grades were very good. Benito was a standout and intelligent student who passed his exams without any difficulty. He earned a teaching diploma at 19 but felt unsuitable for the job, even at that age. And wanting to avoid military service, he decides to emigrate from his country. So he leaves Italy for Switzerland, jumping from one job to another. He was a bricklayer, butcher, laborer, and doorman. While living in Switzerland, he gained a certain reputation as a young man of strange magnetism, with his prominent jaw, his dark, penetrating eyes, and his remarkable rhetorical talent. He was an outstanding declaimer of poetry and also vociferously delivered fierce speeches from the authors he voraciously consumed in multiple languages, because he was also a polyglot, from Friedrich Nietzsche and Spinoza to Hegel, Karl Marx, Kropotkin, and Sorel. He never stopped studying and even managed to take classes from the famous Vilfredo Pareto. This love of reading, combined with what he learned from his father's socialist doctrine, allowed him to relate Hegel and George Sorel's national trade unionism in a unique, revolutionary, agitating, and impactful personality. Naturally inclined towards politics, he begins to write, works as a journalist and socialist activist, writes propaganda for unions, organizes strikes, and from his writings he promotes the use of force as a means to achieve the goals of the working class. Is he making a name for himself in the political world? And more than once he serves hard times behind bars, until he is finally deported from Switzerland and returns to Italy. In 1904, an occasion when more than one newspaper in Rome highlights his return. On his return, he settles in Udine in the Venetian Alps, where he lived what he described as a period of moral decay. So to sustain himself, he resumes teaching. But soon, tired of living that quiet life, he returns to trade union life, journalism, and an environment of extreme politics, which we will describe later on. To fully understand this phenomenon, because Mussolini's doctrine was the result of a series of elements that many attribute only to him as a person, without taking into account the historical context through which his native Italy was going through. In 1909, Mussolini falls in love with 16-year-old Rachel Judy, the youngest daughter of his father's lover. He moves in with her in an apartment in Forlì, and they eventually marry. After the wedding, Mussolini is imprisoned for the 5th time, but he is already a well-known union leader among the socialists, perhaps one of the most dangerous. After writing for socialist newspapers, he founded the Class Struggle publication. And in 1912, he was appointed director of the official newspaper of the Italian Socialists, called Avanti, as its director. He doubled the print run in circulation. The socialists grow in number, and Benito's popularity increases. In this newspaper, Mussolini opposes Italy joining World War I, using socialist rhetoric of proletarian brotherhood to the people. But reading, Karl Marx gets the idea that wars often lead to social revolutions, and he also persuaded that the defeat of Allied France would be a lethal blow to Europe and Italy. He decides to change his stance and promote a warmongering discourse, which puts him in disgrace with the country's socialists who opposed the war. He is expelled from the party and resigns from the direction of Avanti. This change in stance would be pivotal in his future political career and in the development of a new national doctrine distinct from socialism and liberalism. Looking for work, he raises money with entrepreneurs linked to arms in Italy and with the people of Italy, where he embraces syndicalist nationalism as a flag. Additionally, he promotes Italy's incorporation into the war. In August of 1915, he volunteered to go to the front line as a simple soldier, but demonstrated great courage and boldness. Until in February of 1917, he was gravely wounded, staying hospitalized for 4 months. Italy underwent transformations in all aspects during and after the Great War. No more than 50 years had passed since Italy had unified as a single nation. With the arrival of the war, the Italian state introduced an interventionist policy in the economic and social sphere, where furthermore the state was the main client of all industry. The working class was militarized and the state became the arbiter of collective contracts. The entry of women into the workforce led to a drop in wages, and the executive increased its faculties. Millions of peasant soldiers were forced to pay taxes. Was his recruitment a process of acculturation or national integration, and was it done by force? The proverbial resilience of the peasant was put to the harsh test of the trenches. Great poets and artists such as Gabriele D'Annunzio, Giovanni Papini, Filippo Tommaso, Marinetti, and Giuseppe Presolini would emerge from there. After World War I, Italy was treated as a defeated power in various international agreements. The post-war reconfiguration led to increased unemployment and a broken economy in Italy. The Italians were on the winning side, but they felt they had lost. They looked at their allies and felt that in the distribution that was the Treaty of Versailles, they were left with nothing but crumbs. For their part, the Italian soldiers, deeply affected by the horrors of war, had problems reintegrating at home. The perception was of a declining Italy in the face of a rapidly changing world. Mussolini later wanted to capitalize on the feeling of dissatisfaction that overcame Italian society after the end of the war, by calling for a fight against the left-wing parties, whom he blamed for this debacle. Along with Marxism and various forms of conservatism, liberal and democratic philosophies were the ones that prevailed with strength in European establishments of that time. Added to the social discontent of the Italians, the crisis of an Italian liberal state arises, seen as incapable, weak, and blamed for the war by its citizens. Mussolini faces this picture of moral, economic, and social weakening of the Italian people. And to act politically, he required a base. That's why in Milan, on the 23rd of March, 1919, in the hall of the Industrial and Commercial Alliance in Piazza San Sepolcro, he founded the Italian Factions of Combat. The word factio came from faxes, an emblem of military power in ancient Rome, symbolizing strength through unity. The so-called Santo Sepolcro program, which is important to know as Mussolini's first programmatic basis of fascism, commenced with a nationalist halo saying, "Italians, here is the program of a purely Italian movement." End of quote. This program contained in its essential points universal suffrage, which included women's voting rights, an 8-hour workday, and minimum wages, the participation of workers' organizations in the operation and administration of the industries and services. And I quote, "when these workers' organizations are worthy of it, morally and technically," end quote. It also included heavy taxes on large capital, the modification of the pension bill, lowering the age from 65 to 55 years, the obligation for agricultural owners to cultivate their lands, with the threat that those who did not do so should pass them to workers' cooperatives. In turn, imperialist politics would be a constant feature of the fascist regime, which must establish a new political order. With the annexation of Fiume and Dalmatia, which were territories where there had been a significant Italian presence. Finally, the forceful words expressed in the third paragraph will be used for a long time. Mussolini gives his movement a deeply anti-socialist dimension in order to oppose the maximalist line of the Italian Socialist Party. The combat fascio should serve to attract the working masses towards a new national syndicalism. In these early stages, the movement isn't yet a party, but declares itself to be anti-party. Faced with the crisis of the so-called Red Biennium, Mussolini, increasingly agitator and profiled as the ultimate leader of the growing fascist movement, captivated with his appearance and his followers. With their imposing narrative and aesthetic of a national, popular, and cultural movement, they quickly became the repository of national outcry seeking changes amid widespread discontent. Fascism openly accepted violence as a form of struggle from revolutionary socialism. They adopted their methods after seeing how they managed to seize power in Russia using such tool. But for them, this was just a detail of history, as the Italian nationalist movement was anti-Bolshevik and anti-liberal. In a time when liberal democracy was something new but also a failure in the eyes of many Europeans, fascism sought to position itself with its own identity from its nation and its soil, which indeed earned it a rapid rise in members and popularity, winning its first seats in parliament. The fascist doctrine continued to consolidate as the movement grew. A non-fanatical reading of this trend will notice that fascism was neither left, nor right, nor socialist, nor capitalist, nor conservative, nor clerical. For fascism, national unity is above the Marxist class struggle or racial pride. It also abhors liberal democracy, considering it individualistic and harmful to the community bonds of man. The fascist state claims to govern all fields, including the economic, in function of national elevation. In Mussolini's own words, fascism should be conceived above all in its spiritualist way. I open quotes. For fascism, the world is not this material world that appears on the surface, where man is an individual separate from everyone else, and it is governed by a law that drives it to live a life of pleasure, selfish and momentary. The man of fascism is the individual who is nation and homeland. Moral law that binds individuals and generations in a tradition and a mission that institutes a superior life and duty." End quote. For his part, Mussolini was not the only fascist author, nor was he the only intellectual author of that movement. There were authors, painters, poets, sculptors, engineers, and other elements of Italian social fiber who, through fascism as an integrating element, saw it as a mechanism to revive national patriotism. And could Italy become a great power? The year was 1922, and Mussolini was presented with the perfect opportunity. The remnants of the socialist trade union movement had called a general strike in Italy. Mussolini declares that unless the government prevented such a strike, the fascists would do it. And indeed, that's what happened. The fascists defeated the strikers, and faced with a government weaker than their fascist movement, They saw with Mussolini the time to seize power. On October 24th, 1922, Mussolini threatened, saying, "Either they hand us power or we will march on Rome on October 28th, 1922. Mussolini's militias marched in columns called the Quadriumviri towards the city, but Mussolini did not march with them. He was betting that King Victor Emmanuel III, as was typical of the Italian political system, would make a political agreement with the fascists and enable them to form a government. While Rome was teeming with black shirts, between the 27th and 28th of October, there were frantic negotiations in which the government proposed to King Victor Emmanuel III to sign a state of exception against the fascists. It would have been enough if the Italian army had been present to stop the victorious squads of black shirts singing songs in the streets, waiting for the official leadership to fall. But that did not happen because a troubled monarch followed the advice of his nationalist advisors, who told him that coming to an agreement with the fascists was most appropriate. Meanwhile, Mussolini patiently awaited events in Milan until he finally received the written missive from the king asking him to form a government. Thus he set foot in Rome in black shirt like his companions. Upon arrival, Mussolini says to the king, "I apologize to your majesty for having to present myself with the black shirt tied from returning from the battle, fortunately bloodless, that had to be fought. I bring to your majesty the Italy of Vittorio Veneto, consecrated again by victory, and I am a faithful servant of your majesty." And it is important to note that the rise to power of fascism in Italy was completely legal, in addition to being the result of a formal request from the king. Fascism, as a political movement, had a minority parliamentary representation, so it had to form a coalition government with other political factors in the country. The rise of Deuce to power was favored by a purely circumstantial situation. Many historians tend to overlook that large sectors, including the broad Italian middle class, were satisfied with fascism as a national unification movement. In times of disorder, fascism had institutional and social support from the military, businessmen, bankers, bureaucracy, and the church. While Mussolini's appointment was extra-parliamentary, his leadership of the country was supported by a broad coalition in the legislative arch, composed of fascists, nationalists, populars, social democrats, and a few independent philo-fascists. Thus, in addition to retaining the presidency of the government, Mussolini kept the Ministry of Interior and the Chancellery for himself. But he delegated the portfolios of industry and commerce to right-wing liberals, to the Social Democrats. He handed them the ministries of labor and public works. He gave the colonial portfolios to the nationalists and the war and navy portfolios to the military. In summary, the fascists controlled the bureaucratic and administrative apparatus of the Italian state.
Tell you, vast multitude, that this 20th century will be the century of fascism. It will be the century of Italian power. It will be the century in which Italy will return for the third time to be the director of human civilization.
Mussolini's government was traditionally liberal in its early years of 1923 and 1924. Already oriented towards an authoritarianism that would be aimed at transforming the Italian state, according to the fascist vision, with the support, yes, from the majority of Italians. Thus, the parliamentary system and political representation based on elections begin to crumble, and the transformations of the central state and its peripheral institutions are set in motion. By December 3rd of 1922, Mussolini and his followers had already obtained full powers from Parliament to implement an administrative reform. But invested with full powers, the fascist government did not limit itself to adopting administrative provisions, but aspired to build an apparatus that would allow them the integration of the party into the state. as well as creating a network of powers parallel to the traditional one known as the dual state, thus consolidating a militia of their own in the so-called Great Council of Fascism. From the start of his government, Mussolini has a strong economic recovery. Italian products penetrated American and European markets, and industrializing economic liberalism governed freely, strengthening the economy. Similarly, a profound tax reform was carried out to abolish direct and extraordinary taxes, and with frozen wages, they let the free market govern rents. During the nearly 2 decades of Mussolini's rule before World War II, with a unique economic policy that cannot be pigeonholed into any traditional theory, Italy had a stronger economy than its European peers. Thus begins the development of the fascist corporate state. This fascist corporatism sought to organize the economy into large guilds or corporations for each industry. Decisions would be made by the workers, businessmen, and officials under fascism in order to achieve a harmonious and fair relationship among everyone, as opposed to the Marxist class struggle. Private enterprise was considered as the most useful economic instrument for the nation's interest. But the company's director was accountable to the state, which guided the nation as a whole. In the educational area, the doctrine of classic instruction of the Gymnasium Lyceum was imposed to form comprehensive citizens and the governing elites both mentally and physically, under the tutelage of the Catholic Church. Culturally, the government action sought to transform and elevate the citizen in work, education, and religion. It was a national purpose to level the consciences through the exaltation of heroic dynamism and warlike instincts. In Mussolini's words, fascism conceives life as struggle, considering that it is up to the man himself to conquer the life that is truly worthy of him. This also refers to the nation and humanity. From here, the high value of culture, religion, art, and education, as well as the essential value of work with which man overcomes nature. Life as conceived by the fascist is serious, austere, religious, entirely delivered in a world sustained by the moral and responsible forces of the spirit. The fascist despises the comfortable life." End quote. In August 1924, after the weakening of a fragmented political opposition, the repressive action of the militia, and the rise in popularity of the Fascist Party, a group of 15 members presents Mussolini a proposal to strengthen executive, union, and corporate orders, so that the head of government would stop answering to a bland parliament and, in a primum inter pares way, would only answer to the king. And so it was the next year, in 1926, full legislative powers were conferred to the executive branch. With this, Mussolini's dictatorship is formally installed in the Roman style. With that, appealing to Italy's urgent need for stability, came the so-called fascist laws of 1926. To defend this new state order, the death penalty was introduced. Opposition passports were annulled so they could not flee the country. Anti-fascist media were shut down and subversives were pursued. The parliamentary remnants that opposed it had a tough time, with their parliamentary immunity breached and agitator communist deputies detained, like the famous Antonio Gramsci. That same year, there is a ministerial change in the economic portfolio, which signifies a departure from liberalism and a move towards state protectionism. Accompanied by increased social assistance and public works, the large companies were the most benefited. The Italian currency appreciated compared to the pound sterling, and this resulted in a strong price deflation, favored by credit restrictions and greater austerity in the central bank. According to the fascist doctrine, the state should only intervene in economic production when private initiative is insufficient or absent, or when it touches the political interests of the state. Mussolini's government exerted influence over private property, but did not nationalize it or fully control it. Rather, large corporations developed a close alliance with the Italian state. By the threshold of the 30s, Italy was already a mass regime. The liberal state was dismantled. Despite the maintenance of the Libertine Statute of 1848, the state had already radically changed in substance and form, with Mussolini at the head as the supreme leader of Italy. In contrast, 1930s diplomacy with fascist governments was characterized by expansionism. Mussolini and his followers looked with absolute disdain that the Versailles Treaty gave Italy so little in relation to the rest of the Allies. And they focused on the regional importance of the Mediterranean Sea, which they called the Mare Nostrum, our sea. Thus, the need arises for control of the area, its waters, and its lands. And the bidding for the African conquest begins, in which the Italian colonies of Libya, Eritrea, and Senegal were of vital importance. There, the Italian army, driven by the state military apparatus, displays its obvious superiority over the locals, even winning the fascist government a disregard at an international level due to the disproportion of the fight. During this period, the National Socialist Germans decide to annex the territories they traditionally considered theirs, which brings them into conflict with Mussolini, but which, in the name of cooperation between nationalist European nations, allows Northerners and Austrians, regions which Italy had been protectorate of, to, in a way, come under the tutelage of the Reich.
The declaration of war has been handed to the ambassadors of Great Britain and France. Italian people, run to the arms!
At the outbreak of the Second World War, Mussolini declared Italy as non-belligerent. The country was trying to recover from economic embargoes and the crash of the New York Stock Exchange. But the fascist propaganda drove the country to go into the conflict. The rhetoric of Mussolini himself, haughty, impetuous, and desiring Italy to have a place in the Olympus of the theater of nations, required it. So in less than a year, they went from the so-called armed peace to intervention with Germany. And it's there where Mussolini's mistakes as a military strategist would cost Italy the war, and by extension, the German Reich. Italy decided to enter the war on June 10th of 1940, attacking France, taking the coastal city of Menton. About Mussolini in private, Adolf Hitler said, "First they were too cowardly to participate, and now they are in a hurry to divide the spoils." He said this after Germany had already comfortably occupied Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, and Belgium with the effective blitzkrieg. In this context, Mussolini proposed sending 8 million bayonets, as he put it, against the plutocratic and reactionary democracies of the West that had obstructed the forward march and the existence of the Italian people. End of quote. But the reality is that his army was not well equipped at all. They had not organized a war economy. In September of the year 40, while the skies of London were trembling with the bombs of the Luftwaffe, General Graziani's armies, in service to Mussolini, entered Egypt up to the oasis of Sidi el Barani with the intention of taking the Suez Canal in the hands of the British. But the poor Italian equipment and the English counteroffensive in December caused the Italians to retreat and lose. Cities successively, one after another, Tobruk, Somalia, and Ethiopia, where 100,000 Italian soldiers are captured. By May of 1941, Mussolini's Italian empire was collapsing. Hitler was furious at the incompetence of his ally, who preferred to immerse himself, write, and exercise in his grand palace, while his troops were losing on all fronts. The Italian soldiers, poorly equipped, were dying in the Balkan marshes at the hands of Tito's partisan guerrilla warfare. All of this had caused terrible abdominal pains on a compulsive smoker, Mussolini, the result of stomach ulcers that incapacitated him. That man, known for hosting grand banquets and lavish meals, was reduced to meals of lukewarm milk and fruit purees to stay nourished. The Germans allied with the Japanese and they attacked Pearl Harbor. Thus, the United States joins the war. The common Italians saw their children go to war and not return. As a result, hunger strikes and a huge absenteeism were causing a paralysis of the national productive apparatus that the fascists worked so hard to promote. In July of 1943, the Germans line up for the Soviet front and things get even more complicated. Amid these setbacks, a coup d'etat against Mussolini is planned in Italy in 1943. By July 10th, the Allies had taken Sicily. The Grand Council of Fascism with Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law, with General Vittorio Ambrosio, and with King Vittorio Emanuele. On the 24th of July, they discussed the military situation and, in a divided vote of 19-8, asked Mussolini to resign from power. It was the first time in a decade that anyone other than him had legal or martial power. The following day, Captain Paolo Vigneri arrests him and takes him to different locations out of concern for his well-being. And his captors didn't know what to do with him. He couldn't change his clothes, and after a long time renouncing the Catholic religion, he constantly began asking to speak with a Catholic priest so he could confess. Finally, they take him to the Campo Imperatore Hotel, a red building on the slopes of the Apennines in the center of Italy, from which he could only see the meadows above Rome from his window. That life of great power had changed dramatically. From being the son of a blacksmith, teacher, journalist, union leader to the supreme chief of Italy, to being detained in a mere hotel. He could only smoke and think. But one day he saw a series of planes land in the prairies in front of the hotel, and out of there emerge a group of men in black uniforms, heavily armed, charging towards the hotel. One of them, the National Socialist Lieutenant Colonel Otto Scorsese from the Nazi Waffen-SS, was the commander of the operation to rescue the Duchy. The Italian guard captors fled in terror, and 10 minutes later, without firing a single bullet, a twin-engine airplane arrives to take Mussolini to Hitler. Mussolini was confused. He feared what the Allies would do to him, but he was even more afraid of the Germans who took him away at gunpoint. The 14th of September, Mussolini arrives in Rothenburg with much fanfare and is greeted by Hitler with a smile or a public handshake to keep up appearances. Because in private, the reprimand was tremendous, as the war was not going well at all in Italy. After Mussolini's arrest, King Victor Emmanuel and the fascists tried to make peace with the Allies, betraying the pact they had with Germany, something that infuriated Hitler, who ordered the occupation of the northern half of Italy, including Rome. The FO-14 said to Mussolini, "I'll be clear. Northern Italy will be forced to emulate the fate of current Poland. If you don't want to rekindle the alliance between Italy and Germany by taking over a new state and government." Thus, Mussolini accepts the proposal, and the Italian Social Republic, a puppet state of Nazi Germany, is set up in Milan. That lasted 600 days, during which Mussolini didn't really govern, rather he mainly gave speeches. On June 4th, 1944, the Allies arrived in Rome as Mussolini prepared to surrender and flee to Switzerland. Mussolini spends the following months in deep stress. The advance of Allied troops after D-Day with the taking of Paris left Italy and Germany as the only remnants of the war in Europe. So Mussolini abandons hope of making peace with the Allies and dedicates himself to the hope that the Germans will win a war of attrition. He hoped that General Francisco Franco would accept him in Spain and heads to Milan on April 18, 1945, to orchestrate his escape from the country, surprised by the news that Germans and Italians were preparing a surrender. As the Axis forces face inevitable defeat, he chooses to depart Milan for Switzerland, intending to reach Spain from there. With him, some Waffen-SS soldiers escorted him through paths in northern Italy to take him to Switzerland. On the morning of April 27th, the vehicle Mussolini was riding in was stopped by a patrol of Italian communist partisans, under the command of a bloodthirsty communist named Urbano Lazzaro, who in guerrilla warfare collaborated with the Allies against the fascists. When the partisans saw the face of that man, who was in statues, posters, newspapers, and photographs, they recognized him immediately. and the German SS handed him over, hoping to avoid an exchange of fire and to be allowed to flee the country. Benito Mussolini was cornered and feared for his life. Over the next day, the men who captured him relocated him and his girlfriend Clara Petacci to various hideouts. On the morning of April 28th, in a humble house in Dongo, they put them in a Fiat and drive them to the village of Ulino de Messagra, where they were brought to the doors of Villa Belmonte. Mussolini and his girlfriend were executed without a word. Even after their death, they continued to beat and disfigure Italy's strongman. They were taken to Milan, and on April 29, 1945, they were displayed at a gas station hung up on cattle meat hooks, where they were subjected to all kinds of outrages by a mob. This was a humiliation without parallel in history, which the detractors of fascism justify as a way to confirm the man's death, who should, according to the democratic belief, face justice before being hanged upside down in the street. After violating their bodies, the corpse of the man who was once the supreme Italian leader was placed in a wooden and hay box and buried in an anonymous grave. Shortly after the end of the war, on April 22 of 1946, Mussolini's remains were stolen from the Muskoka cemetery by a group of fascists. His remains were recovered several months later, and in 1957 they were buried in the Predoppio Chapel in his native village. Such was the life of Italy's strongman, Benito Mussolini, son of a blacksmith, teacher, agitator, unionist, and dictator, who went down in the annals of history as one of the responsible for the rise and fall of one of the most innovative political currents of the 20th century, as well as one of the most rejected and least studied from its very origin. We hope you enjoyed this documentary, and we invite you to share it on all your social networks and with all your acquaintances. Also, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, give it a like, and turn on the notification bell. Reynaldo Carrillo spoke to you, and this is the New Encyclopedia. Thank you.